we need to talk a little bit about Ethiopia, right? So let's just take a quick look at a little map, okay? It's a little geographical map of Ethiopia, right? So as you might notice, God, oh God, okay. As you might notice, this is a lot of mountains. This is what geologists call mountainous. All right, and it basically being a mountainous country means it is uh one colossal unassailable bunker fortress. Okay, it's like Iran, but in Africa. All right. Now, this is a nightmare to invade, which is why it was never taken over during the scramble for Africa by the colonial powers. Right. This is nightmare fuel. Like, on top of it being one of the oldest civilizations on the planet, which means that, like, they've had literally thousands of years to build underground fortresses and Minecraft basements for the Zoomers out there. And this is going to be relevant, okay? This is just keep in mind when talking about Ethiopia in this conversation. This place is one colossal natural fortress. It also happens to be one of the most populated countries in Africa. It has a population of over 100 million people, which is a lot. That is a third the size of America, and it is projected to grow to colossal proportions to be one of the most populated countries on the planet within the next 5 to 10 years. Okay? So with that in mind, one of the notable things about Ethiopia's geography is that it is not connected to any real ocean ports. It's kind of, you'll notice when we zoom out here, landlocked. Which means that there are a number of countries here that effectively control ports and shipping into Ethiopia. And this is something that the leaders of Ethiopia are keenly aware of. Yes, they have 126 million people in Ethiopia. Like, it is slated to enter the top 10 most populous countries within, like, again, 5 to 10 years. But they have no ports. Currently, all of their resources have to be imported over land or by air. And when it's imported via land, the countries on the sea borders here charge billions of dollars in fees to Ethiopia to ship supplies into the country, which is something that is only going to grow more and more as the population of Ethiopia grows more and more. Now, we also, when we are talking about all of this, we also need to keep in mind something else, okay? And that is the Grand Renaissance Dam. Now, for those of you who are unaware, the Grand Renaissance Dam is essentially one of the largest hydroelectric projects in the world, and it is being built to dam the Nile. Now, if you guys remember your geography of Africa and geography of the Nile, you might understand that Egypt famously has their entire civilization built around the functioning of the Nile. And damming the Nile River is something that, one, would solve Ethiopia's energy crisis, but two, has the potential to completely, like, destroy Egypt's current operating economy. And there have been negotiations between Egypt and Ethiopia for a while now to try and come to an arrangement whereby Ethiopia could still finish building the dam and could also slowly fill up the reservoir, which would keep it going. However, that would delay the project by potentially a decade or more. Yeah, it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And this has led to a lot of tension between Egypt and Ethiopia. So keep that in mind, because that is also critical background information for understanding what is going on right now in Ethiopia. Okay? Hannah Reloaded, thank you very much for the raid. We are currently talking about the current rumblings that Ethiopia is about to invade Eritrea. So we're going to continue talking about that. But to catch you guys up, Ethiopia has hella mountains, making it very difficult to invade by an outside force. And also, they're building a colossal dam, one of the largest hydroelectric projects in the world, on the Nile, which a lot of neighboring countries are very angry about because it has the potential to destroy their entire economies if anything were to affect the normal flow of the Nile River. So welcome, everybody. Also, my name's Riverboat Jack. Hi, hit the follow button, etc. So, yeah, I mean, things have degraded from the kind of normalized talks between Egypt and Ethiopia. And I think we talked about this story maybe a year or two ago. But this is from September 10th of this year. The Egyptian Foreign Ministry condemns the move, again, filling the Grand Renaissance Dam, calling Ethiopia's filling of the dam illegal. So, essentially, Egypt is like, hey, what if you delayed filling the dam reservoir by 10 years and just slowly filled it? And Ethiopia is like, nah, we have to fill up this reservoir in order to get electricity and have it be operational. We spent, I think the Grand Renaissance Dam project is one of the most expensive public works projects in the world right now. Let me just look up real quick. How much does this cost? Yeah, it's about $5 billion to build this one dam. It is big. It's damn big, okay? Not to mention the fact that, once it's filled up, if anything were to happen to, the structure of the dam itself, the flooding downstream would be catastrophic. So, again, there are a lot of reasons for neighboring countries to be hesitant, especially Egypt. All right? So we're kind of I just want to emphasize that. Right? Yeah, it would be one of the largest floods in Egypt, a place known for flooding. Is the dam subsidized by China? It could have been subsidized by China. It wouldn't surprise me if it were, simply because the Belt and Road Initiative is so wide-reaching. Can we look at cost and financing? Perfect. Yeah, so this project, by the way, was started in 2016. And back in 2016, the cost of this dam was almost 10% of Ethiopia's GDP. It is one of the most expensive projects the country has ever undertaken. Yes, about 1/5 of the cost is funded by China. Yes. So, yeah. Basically, Ethiopia considers this dam critical to its future survival, kind of future-proofing its electrical grid and ability to generate power and energy for itself. But the surrounding countries are absolutely, absolutely like livid and hesitant about it, right? Now, one other thing to note, and this I think should kind of bring into full picture what is going on here. There is a country north of Ethiopia called Eritrea. Okay? Now, Eritrea is a small country. And here we'll just throw this up on screen real quick. And is largely the product of Italian colonialism, believe it or not. So right now, Ethiopia gets a lot of its goods from Djibouti, one of the main ports that ships to Addis Ababa. However, Eritrea used to be part of Ethiopia and essentially broke away in the 90s, late 90s, and has kind of been its own independent state ever since. It's been independent for about 30 years. There have been hostilities between Ethiopia and Eritrea ever since kind of their civil war that broke it apart. But the major demarcation between Eritrea and Ethiopia is that Eritrea was an Italian colony for, I think, like 80 years, about. So the break is largely predicated along a line of colonialist control of the region. So right now, there is somewhat of a uneasy peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea. However, and you know, we look who's downriver from Ethiopia. You've got a lot of folks along the Nile. Okay? Got a lot of folks here. Egypt and Sudan and oh, wouldn't you know it, Eritrea. And this has led to some very well-founded speculation that a lot of the hostilities between Ethiopia and various breakaway regions or groups, both within Eritrea and Ethiopia itself, are being funded by the Eritrean government, Sudan, and Egypt. So, in part, in no small part, because of this dam. So, it is complicated, but to boil down what my understanding of the current situation, and of course that can be flawed, but my understanding is that you have Ethiopia, this country that is poised to become one of the most populous places on the planet, basically looking around and saying, hey, we could retake Eritrea because we have over 120 million people in our country. And what Eritrea's population? Eritrea's population is 3.6 million. So, again, like, they have a population less than 4% that of Ethiopia right now. And Ethiopia is looking at that and being like, hey, we could take over Eritrea, have ourselves port access to the Red Sea, which, by the way, is being fueled by kind of like their historical legacy of being, again, one of the oldest populations, not oldest populations, oldest civilizations on the planet. Again, Ethiopia used to be like one of the premier powers on the planet, like going back 1,000 years, you know? And they used to have dominion kind of over the Red Sea. So this is largely being fueled by kind of this nationalistic fervor that is being kind of pushed as like a return to old glory, right? And they're looking at Eritrea as kind of rebuilding the Ethiopian empire, and also logistically having access to the Red Sea is incredibly, incredibly beneficial for their economy and for their future growth. And also, they're looking to kind of like shore up the defense of this dam, which is again kind of critical to their entire national infrastructure. And you might be looking at this map and saying, well, but why aren't they going after Djibouti? And that's because Addis Ababa has a dedicated electric railway connecting Djibouti directly to their capital to allow for transportation of goods. No such infrastructure has been built or exists between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Not on this scale, anyway. So basically, in a nutshell, again, Ethiopia has this critical dam that is like one of their necessary things going forward. And they also have this rail infrastructure into Djibouti.
African geopolitics, Jack.
Yeah. So this is all kind of the issue here. Here is an interesting podcast that I came across. This is from just last week, but it is going to give a lot of information about the potential for war between Eritrea and Ethiopia as it stands right now. And I think that that is actually really, really important. And it will also provide us with some insight into the situation that has been happening between Ethiopia and Tigray, which I haven't even touched on here, but there will be more information in here. So let's go. This is a podcast called The Horn, put together by the International Crisis Group, and should shed some more light on the situation. Let's take a listen.
Hi, and welcome to The Horn, a podcast from the International Crisis Group. I'm Alan Boswell. Today, we have Michael Woldemariam back on the show. Michael is a professor at the University of Maryland, and he is a senior fellow at the Center for Security and International Studies there. He's on the show to discuss developments in Ethiopia as well as with its neighbor, Eritrea. Michael, welcome back on the show.
Good to be with you, Alan.
So it's been 1 year since this Pretoria agreement ended the war in northern Ethiopia, mostly in Tigray. At the time of this agreement 1 year ago, you had a broad coalition that the federal government had essentially forged and mobilized against the Tigrayans. You had Eritrea involved, you had neighboring Amhara and Afar regions also fighting against Tigray and the TPLF. So, the federal government signs this deal. It surprised, I think, many when it came, but, these other actors, the Eritreans, the Amhara, they were not there at the peace talks. So there was obviously big relief at the time, but there was big questions on, if it would hold. Obviously there's a lot of skepticism that...
Just to give you guys a little map feature here on this conflict in particular. Tigray is a state to the south of Eritrea.
IDK who needs subbies, so here you go. Paying Kyreu's generosity forward less than 3.
Abyssal, thank you for the 5 gifted tier 1 subs. I really, really appreciate that. Oh yeah, OG Mountain Dragon. I'm sure there is U.S. involvement on some level in this. However, mainly right now, this seems to be a regional conflict that is kind of at odds with Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and potentially a couple other surrounding countries. But largely, I don't have a sense or a feel of U.S. involvement in this at this point. But this gives you a little bit of just kind of a visual guide of where Tigray is, why it is being brought up in the context of escalating Eritrean or escalating tensions with Eritrea. And yeah, as you can see, there's a reason why there's some speculation of like funding of Tigrayan separatists in this area. from like the likes of Egypt, Sudan, and Eritrea itself. Keeps the conflict largely out of Eritrea. But this is again just like slightly, take all of this with a grain of salt, all right?
After such a bit of war, the two sides would actually stop fighting. But then I think on the back end of that, there was also concerns that an end to one war could prove the seeds and roots of future wars. And I think that's kind of the context we really want to dive into now. You now have fighting in Amhara, which looks like a new war. You have these escalating Ethiopia-Eritrea tensions. Let's go ahead and dive in one by one, and then we'll try to connect all these pieces. So let's start with the situation in Tigray. Obviously, the peace deal did end that war. How safe does it look that peace in Tigray itself will at least continue to hold?
I think, off the top, it is important to note, and you did allude to this, that in many ways, Pretoria and its subsequent arrangements were a success. When this deal was signed in November of 2022, the war in northern Ethiopia was really entering a very dark chapter. Tigrayan defenses had broken down in the northwestern part of Tigray. Some key towns had been occupied, places like Shire, Aksum, and there was a high likelihood, or a real likelihood, that coalition forces were going to retake many of Tigray's urban centers and towns, and that the TDF would flee to the hills and wage sort of asymmetric warfare from that position. In that context, humanitarian conditions for Tigrayan civilians were likely to get much worse than they already were, and they were horrible by that point in the conflict. And so Pretoria.
Yeah, we should also. It is worth mentioning that Ethiopia's dealing with the Tigrayan situation was incredibly brutal. Like, incredibly brutal. To the point where, again, it's been labeled as a genocide, or, Human Rights Watch calls it an ethnic cleansing. It has been just a colossal atrocity.
Effectively stopped that scenario, and the break and fighting has held for the most part. And so, on that level, this is
non-binary. You got pinged by the bot because you were copy pasting stuff into chat, and when you copy paste stuff rapidly into chat, it puts off the bot.
This is a real success. And, subsequent to that, in implementing Pretoria, the parties did things that were politically very, very difficult for them, right? I mean, the TDF gave up its heavy weapons, allowed for federal troops to enter Mekelle, control federal installations. The federal government, for its part, improved humanitarian access, resumed core public services, took the difficult step in Ethiopia's parliament, federal parliament, to normalize, re-legalize TPLF. The two sides agreed on interim administration, and generally, just you think back to the war. I mean, the rhetoric between the parties of the conflict was hot. That acrimonious rhetoric has cooled, I think, almost.
Yeah, to kind of shed a little bit more light on this, basically, like, an atrocity would happen in Tigray, and Eritrea would blame Ethiopia, and Ethiopia would blame Eritrea, and basically international oversight has kind of been like, y'all were both doing like genocidal actions in Tigray. Like it's just like it is one of the worst conflicts in the world for basically until like last year when the peace agreement was reached. And it got better, but it's not great. Like I mean, it is like just looking over like lists of what happened in the Tigray War. Like systematic rape was used to kind of try and suppress conquered populations. Like we're talking like as extreme as war crimes get. Doesn't Israel also do some shit in Ethiopia? I mean, probably, but Israel's primary interests are not in Ethiopia. Like it's like we're talking like again, mass killings, systematic rape and torture, like it's about as bad as human beings can possibly get, is kind of what we're looking at within the Tigrayan war. So it's yeah.
It's completely subsided. But I think there are obviously challenges that many observers have pointed to. I think the humanitarian situation in Tigray is really still quite poor. There are recent reports of starvation deaths. As you know, the international community has, particularly the United States, has suspended food assistance to Ethiopia. That's a compounding factor. And there is continuing disagreement between federal authorities and the U.S. government about how exactly to restart that food assistance. DDR in Tigray remains incomplete. You've got thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people still under arms. And now it's worth here, I think, noting that Pretoria's timetable for the disarmament of light weapons was never really realistic. So we shouldn't be surprised this is still a problem. And then, of course, there's the question of frontiers. I mean, Tigray's western and northern frontiers remain contested, unresolved. There are reports of continuing human rights violations in western Tigray.
Yeah, so kind of the western Tigray area over here, borders Sudan, Eritrea, and Ethiopia here, and it is one of the I guess hot spots for just war crimes against the Tigrayan people. I mean, guys, it's bad. I'm just going to I mean like we're talking like the worst forms of torture that you can imagine, along with the worst forms of like sexual violation you can imagine, often done to target specific ethnic groups within Tigray. So, yeah. And yeah, the U.S. has covert bases in the region, but again, none of like the Tigray war serves U.S. interests. What would serve U.S. interests is like toppling a government, that isn't willing to trade with the U.S. Like the covert bases in Africa are largely there as like contingencies or to like provide favors to different governments we're aligned with there. So like it's not. It is sussy as hell, but to like be like, yes, the U.S. has bases in the continent of Africa, therefore the U.S. has secretly been masterminding the Tigray war, is just kind of like it's childish. That isn't. You need to have evidence to back that up, and there's just none of that I'm aware of at this time.
Wilkite in the Tigray-Eritrea borderlands, in these cases perpetrated by Amhara militia, Eritrean forces. These are certainly the allegations.
Also, just keep in mind, human beings are quite capable of being horrendous, even without U.S. influence.
And there's an IDP problem because of the displacement from these areas, a continuing problem. Now, more generally, I mean, you alluded to the coalition that prosecuted the war in the north, the federal government, a variety of Amhara militia forces, and then the Eritrean government. That coalition...
True, Malachi. The U.S. will not intervene in like a conflict like the Tigray war because, again, the U.S. doesn't necessarily have like a stake in the outcome of it. Like U.S. interests are not hinged on the Tigray war. So like the U.S. might step in as like a third party, like diplomatic mediator, but it's not going to like. We're not going to commit boots on the ground in Ethiopia to stop this when there's no U.S. interest involved there. Yeah. Yeah, Calliope Salcrame. One would think that the fact that bin Laden was not based would be common, and yet TikTok is proving us wrong every day. We'll get to it.
Has fragmented in some notable ways, and we could get into that. But I think a key challenge or continuing challenge for Pretoria has been that this was a multi-sided civil war. And those that fought alongside the federal government had their own particular interests. And two of those parties, Amhara political forces and the Eritreans, were not a party to the Pretoria Agreement, and I think in many ways dissatisfied with it rather. And so there certainly is a potential for renewed conflict between those forces and the Tigrayans. But indeed, again, as you noted earlier, there is conflict between the Amhara and the federal government, or Amhara forces and the federal government, and the potential for conflict between the Eritreans and the federal government, which I wouldn't say necessarily is a likely possibility, but it is a real possibility that needs to be accounted for.
What's your sense of the relationship between the Tigrayan elite, the TPLF, the TDF top people, and Abiy and the federal government right now? Is it still quite testy? Is it something like a very tentative alliance? How would you characterize it?
Yes, I mean, I would characterize it as a tentative alliance. I mean, I think relations, particularly between the interim administration and the federal government, are functional.
Yeah, like this is a point where we just need to add, like, they're functional. They're not good. Like, this conflict just ended a little while ago. It is a tentative agreement for peace and cooperation, but it is not at all definitive, which just has Ethiopian armed forces like at the ready, right? Ethiopia ready to go at it. And Eritrea ready to go at it. And like Tigray caught in the middle. It's yeah. It has the potential to be like just a regional powder keg. Beyond what we saw from 2020 to 2021 or 2022.
There are areas of tension that are being worked through, but those areas of tension are real, and I do think separate the two sides. On the Tigrayan side, I mean, I think there are concerns about sort of the slow pace of implementation of Pretoria. They very much tethered themselves to the letter of Pretoria and want, at least their argument is want it implemented in full. And so, for instance, on the issue of the disputed territories, Western Tigray / Wolkite, I mean, I think they have concerns about the federal government seeming inability to get those territories transferred back to Tigray. The federal government has now recently said that, consistent with the Constitution, their view will proceed with the referendum.
And again, in case you haven't picked it up, Pretoria is the name of the kind of armistice agreement between Ethiopia and Tigray.
Referendum in those areas. So that I think there is some concern on the Tigrayan side about where that whole situation ends up. Obviously, the humanitarian conditions overall are not great, and I think Tigrayan authorities feel like they could do with more support in that regard. Concerns about, in their view, the positioning of Eritrean forces in Tigrayan districts in the north, although there's some dispute about where exactly the Eritreans are, and I think a feeling in Tigray is that the federal government perhaps has not worked in a robust fashion to get those forces out of Tigray. Accountability, I think, is another area perhaps where the Tigrayan leadership has some concerns. I mean, they have not been particularly vocal about this issue because they don't want to run afoul of the federal government, but I don't think they were pleased by the disbandment of the ICRI mechanism, which basically internationalized the issue of transitional justice in the Ethiopian context. So I think that is the sort of the view perhaps of the Tigrayan elite, and this is a quick summary. I think there are other things we could put on the table. On the side of the federal government, certainly, they are keeping an eye on disarmament. I mean, they've embraced a very flexible schedule on this, and I think do have some utility see some utility in maintaining a large Tigrayan force, infantry force, both in terms of the law and order needs of Tigray, but also in terms of potentially leveraging that force against other adversaries. Potentially, this is somewhat speculative, but I do think my sense is that Addis does worry about elements, what they see as elements of the TPLF that are not as cooperative, or not willing to be as cooperative with the federal government, which they might view as sort of hardliners of the old guard, and worry about its control, influence over the interim administration and political structures across Tigray writ large. So I think that's an area, again, of concern for them, something they're following. I think with the interim administration itself, and of course its leadership, I think the relationship with the federal government is okay, decent, functional.
Yeah, and so even though this disarmament timeline was in some ways the kind of heart and soul of the Pretoria Agreement, perhaps some mutual interest in not having the disarmament fully take place.
I think that's a key point. I think both sides had an interest in slow rolling the disarmament process. Now, the other piece of this is that, if you're going to do DDR, you actually have to fund it. And there's a real lack of resources, both local resources and resources from the international community.
Yeah, so basically part of the Praetorian Agreement was that both sides would, like, dismantle their armaments and, like, like they're demilitarize the zone, as it were, and then reintegrate the region, DDR. Not Dance Dance Revolution, unfortunately.
Community to support disarmament, at least thus far, although I think the United States and other parts of the international community have gestured at recently a willingness to support, through resources, a DDR process.
And
But U.S. bad. But U.S. bad. You mean the United States would commit resources to demilitarizing a zone? That's crazy. It's almost like states can do incredible evil and sometimes slightly good things.
what did Ethiopia get for signing this deal? Obviously, there was a lot of international pressure. I imagine quite a mix of carrot and sticks were put in front of Abiy to try to get him to sign this peace deal. Has that worked out, do you think, in the eyes of Abiy and those around him?
Well, I think vis-a-vis threats that they perceived from Tigray, I think it's mostly worked out in the sense that Tigrayan resistance forces agreed to disarm. I mean, gave up their heavy weapons, have agreed in principle to disarm their infantry forces and light weapons, and also recognized the legitimacy of Prime Minister, of the ruling party in Addis. I think that in that respect, that was a significant achievement for the Prime Minister and the federal authorities. But I think, of course, and we'll get into this, one of the key challenges is that Pretoria itself, and it's not only because of Pretoria, but...
Well, yeah, but Ethiopia has no interest in attacking Djibouti. Like, not only does the U.S. have a naval base there, but Ethiopia has like dedicated infrastructure that takes goods to and from Djibouti. Like they have like invested billions of dollars into building that infrastructure already. Like they don't have an incentive to then destroy or put that infrastructure in danger by attacking Djibouti.
Pretoria did seed other conflicts across Ethiopia, particularly vis-a-vis the Amhara and potentially with Eritrea.
Okay, so we've had...
Oh, and when he's mentioning the Amhara, that is an ethnic group that resides in a region of Ethiopia. Can we bring up a map here? Yeah. So again, the Amhara region is large, and it kind of overlaps with where a lot of the fighting between Ethiopia and the various separatist groups in Tigray were happening. So, yeah, there is a non insignificant overlap here, and that's why the host here is talking about Amhara.
Conflict breakout in Amhara between the federal government and Fano forces, defected special forces from the Amhara government, basically forces who previously had been mobilized as part of this war against Tigray, now fighting with the federal government itself. I want to take listeners back a bit before we get into the specifics.
Lords France, I do encourage you as a conservative to vote for RFK Jr.
Of now. What was the original relationship between the Amhara elite and Abiy? Why did they support him, and why did they join with him to fight the Tigrayans?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of different layers here. I mean, I think in some ways you have to go back to the 2018 transition and the months that followed, months and initial years that followed Abiy's rise. And I think it is true that much of the Amhara political class made common cause with Abiy, helped the prime minister consolidate his power in order to contain, corral, and defeat sort of TPLF dominance of Ethiopian state structures. And so the alliance or the support of the prime minister, and of course, when we talk about the Amhara political field, we're talking about an incredibly diverse space, right, in terms of ideological proclivities, in terms of identity. So, I mean, I'm simplifying somewhat here, but I think the alliance, I think, was seeded at that time, and certainly if you go back to the internal EPRDF maneuvering that led to the prime minister's election, there was an alliance between, as you well know, Oromo and Amhara political factions, and so there was that, I think, preceding.
Yeah. By the way, just as a little bit more background here. DW News, which is again an outlet in Germany, covered this kind of grumbling conflict here. But on top of just desiring ports, which Eritrea has and Ethiopia wants, there has been an ongoing ongoing conflict here with specifically when it comes to kind of the control of Assab, which, yeah, I mean, this article goes more into, but essentially, the Ethiopian prime minister back in 2018 was able to negotiate kind of a peace settlement between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and it included some provisions regarding the Assab port, and it also got him a Nobel Prize, and yeah, part of it is the agreements that the two countries came to in 2018 have not been really honored.
Patriots for RFK Jr. 2024 ha ha ha.
Thank you for the 2 gifted tier 1 subs. Why are you guys telling me what DW news is? I know what DW news is. Sorry, didn't RFK's family immediately release a letter saying he didn't embody American values? Probably, but also I'm supportive of any Republican throwing away their vote on a third-party candidate. That is my official position. I will encourage any conservative to do so. Yeah, since 1998, Ethiopia's access to the port of Assab has been truncated due to the 20-year border war between the neighboring nations that killed tens of thousands of people. The conflict forced Ethiopia to channel its goods and other port-related trades through neighboring country Djibouti, which borders both Ethiopia and Eritrea. When the Eritreans, declared their independence, they were boasting about their ports, that they will use them for developments. They were singing for their ports. A lot has been said about the significance of the ports. Ato Yusuf Yassin, a former Ethiopian diplomat, told DW. Yeah. So basically, also, if you look into recent rhetoric around what Prime Minister Abiy has been saying about Eritrea's ports, the most I can really say, can I? Yeah. Basically, this meme is the official position of Ethiopia regarding Eritrea's ports. Okay, this is state policy from Ethiopia right now. They're looking at the port of Assab and just being like, hell yeah, girl, you looking fine as hell. I'm coming to get you. More chat tell. I didn't mention it's a public broadcaster. I mean, okay. Yeah, basically they said the Ethiopian government is saying like, hey, our country needs ports. Eritrea, you got ports. And you know, if people aren't nicer to us about their ports, we're going to have to do something about that with violence. Incredible acts of violence. Pandora Arbiter, as far as hopes for a third party, and this is what a lot of people in politics don't understand, if you want to break the two-party duopoly, you have to support ranked choice voting, which requires political conflict on a state-by-state level. You have to be advocating for that in your state, because a lot of states don't have ranked choice voting to decide like federal elections. And in order to get third parties and make them viable, you need ranked choice voting. Just because mathematically in a first past the post voting system, like the one we have in the United States, it does not actually work out that third parties are viable. Which is why basically all of the third parties in America right now, and have been for the last 30 years, have been incredibly weak and ineffective. Pando, gotcha. Yeah, so like again, when I'm talking about like voting, I'm talking about in our current paradigm of first past the post being kind of the norm. And if we change that to ranked choice voting, then I'll change my political calculus. But until we kind of get there, that's where we're at. Hey girl, your port's looking so good.
Relationship, but certainly in the context of the Tigray conflict, I think one issue that mobilized many Amhara to back the federal government's military effort in Tigray was the territorial dispute or territorial sort of question over Western Tigray or sort of Wilkai Tumera, a number of areas, and then also disputed territories in the area of Raya. And so there were territorial, I think, claims made there. But I think, stepping back from this, we have to understand, I mean, for the preceding, 3 decades, TPLF had really been sort of the bête noire in Amhara politics. It had been, the source of, at least in terms of perception, the source of the Amhara's sort of overall political marginalization. And so there were these inbuilt historical grievances, I think, that were excavated and mobilized in the moment that the war broke out after November 2022. So now, certainly it's also the case that amongst, again, generalizing here, amongst some Amhara, there is also a desire to reform, to dismantle the system of ethnic federalism that the TPLF and Tigrayan elites, along with others, had helped install in the early 1990s. And I think that was also, a layer to this as well. Insofar as it was seen, the war in Tigray was seen as a vehicle for dismantling ethnic federalism.
So how did the Amhara elites respond to this Pretoria peace deal? I mean,
I want to find the part of this where they talk about conflicts between Eritrea.
Some of the Amhara political elite. There is another layer to this, which is there had been, certainly in the years leading up to Pretoria and even afterwards, a lot of violence against Amhara civilians in parts of Ethiopia outside of the Amhara region, because the Amhara are a geographically very dispersed group, one of the most dispersed major ethnic groups in Ethiopia, and so there had been a lot of violence against Amhara in southern Ethiopia, in the region of Oromia. And
I mean, as far as I know, ranked choice voting allows for a third party, like not just third party, but third, fourth, fifth, sixth party systems. Like mathematically, it would allow for the rise and consolidation of the power of like third party power over time, but like you would still obviously have entrenched power blocks between like Democrats and Republicans. This would just be a way to get other political parties into positions of power, and over time they would develop their own voter base and factionalize Dems and Republicans into like viable subgroups, of candidates.
And that in some ways had soured Amhara. That had been one of the things that soured Amhara political opinion on the prime minister, because they thought he was not taking the steps necessary to protecting those communities. And there was a way in which this is the view of some. This is not my view, but there was a view that the Prosperity Party was increasingly a front for Oromo political interests. And so, you put all that together and you get Pretoria, and you get, of course, there are some real grievances and concerns that come out of that. Now, I could say one other thing, which is that after Pretoria, I think it's earlier this year, maybe April, March of this year, the federal government announces a plan to effectively disarm regional forces and incorporate them into the overall national security architecture. And that really alarms many in the Amhara region. And it alarms them because they're looking at the disarmament process in Tigray and basically saying, well, the Tigrayans are still armed. Why would we be disarmed, right? And of course, from Abi's perspective, the federal government's perspective, they had built up the various Amhara Fano militia during the war in the north. And after that war, I think, had a real interest in sort of reining those militia in. And so disarmament from their perspective made sense, but it created a lot of concern, I think, on the Amhara side.
So how did we lead from this situation up until war, and what is the current situation in Amhara? Yeah,
well, I think the really key inflection point is this decision to disarm regional militia, which, again, as I recall, I have to check the dates, was really, I think it was March, April of this year. Yes. And that I think is the sort of proximate, that's a trigger point, right, for conflict. The various Amhara militia, which are, we're talking about a very diverse constellation of militia forces. This is not really a coherent thing, but there's a sort of broad rejection of this disarmament plan, and it's that point that we see sort of direct conflict. Although there had been incidents of sort of military altercations between Fano militia and federal forces before. And I think since that time, the conflict in Amhara has proven to be, this is my assessment, has proven to be pretty intractable. In August, you had these various militia forces penetrate some key towns and cities in the Amhara region, places like Gondar, Bahir Dar, and the federal government, I think, has had real difficulty putting down the rebellion. Again, it does seem like in the absence of some sort of political settlement in an intractable conflict. First of all, I mean, the Amhara region is large. There are many people there. It does seem as if the rebellion has a significant degree of public support from what.
And you have to remember, this is the Amhara region. Like, it's easy to just kind of like be like, oh yes, it's just a large region. You have to remember, this is the topographical map, right? Like, this is the geography of that region. It is mountainous. If you are trying to fight off anybody, you have an inherent advantage. Like, it's hard for even Ethiopian state forces to, like, crush a rebellion. Which, again, is why, right, when we look at the larger maps here, with, like, Sudan and Egypt here, if they're just funding separatist groups in Ethiopia in order to, give them more time to negotiate about this dam, or to buy Eritrea time to, like, arm up, it's a pretty successful strategy to fund separatist groups. Because, again, those groups are separating in regions that are effectively colossal fortresses.
What I can tell, at least among Amhara within the Amhara region. These are well-armed and well-trained militia forces. They had been built up, again, as I noted before, to a significant degree during the war on Tigray, so fairly battle-hardened forces. And of course, the federal government, for its part, is fighting conflict in other parts of the country, including a very significant security challenge in the Oromo region, particularly Western Oromia in the Welegas. But even beyond it, right? One question is, what is the ceiling of this rebellion? I'm not sure that the rebellion necessarily poses a mortal threat at this juncture to the ruling party in Addis or those who occupy state power in Addis. And there are many reasons for that. One, I think, to pose a challenge to federal authorities in Addis, they would need to build alliances with other militia forces in other parts of the country, and I think that's a continuing challenge from the Amhara perspective. But again, certainly this appears to be an intractable rebellion. There also is the Eritrea side of the equation and speculation about various kinds of support that the Eritrean state might be providing to Amhara forces. But again, that's more speculative, but it's an angle, I think, to be explored.
How much of this do you think was in some ways unavoidable? I think people see, for instance, the Amhara upset at the peace deal and worried that this disputed land, which they seized from the Tigrayans, might go back to the Tigrayans. Meanwhile, the Tigrayans are concerned that it isn't being given back to them. A lot of this looks very zero-sum and almost like a no-win situation. But then, could Abiy have managed this situation better? Was this conflict, did it look inevitable to you?
That's a very tough question, Alan, but it's a good one. I mean, I think Ethiopia, and I've always said this, Ethiopia's challenges are beyond a single person or a single government. I mean, this is a country at this juncture that is structurally unstable. And certainly it was always going to be very difficult. It will always be very difficult, I think, for the federal government, for the prime minister to kind of strike bargains with multiple constituencies across the country that are ideologically and historically diametrically opposed to one another. So certainly as Abiy pursued peace in Tigray, sought to consolidate that peace through Pretoria, it was going to create a reaction in the Amhara region, right?
So another thing to keep in mind here is that, like, the legacy of how isolated some of these regions are presents itself in, like, religious affiliation, right? So there are like, kind of isolated groups of, like, Christians within Ethiopia. There are also large populations of Muslims in Ethiopia, and a lot of them have very, very different ideas of which direction Ethiopia should go in. And a lot of them have very strong regional interests that diverge from a federalized Ethiopian government. So part of why the gigantic dam project is necessary is that through the dam project, through this massive infrastructure, they can bring a lot of the regions within Ethiopia into kind of a symbiotic relationship with the federal government through management of this dam. So, like, the dam means more than just the electricity that it will provide. It also matters for, like, the political integrity of the Ethiopian state as it's constituted right now.
The federal government is now, as I understand, engaged in talks with the OLA in Tanzania, I believe, Zanzibar. Again, you can confirm that. But that's obviously going to complicate the prospects for political settlement in the Amhara region if the federal government decides to go that route at some juncture. And so I think it's a very difficult situation. Now, I don't think I'd go so far to say as, the Amhara reaction, response, or the conflict in Amhara was sort of an inevitable response of Pretoria. I think there are probably some steps that could have been taken to reassure the Amhara, even as the federal government sought to fully commit to Pretoria. But there's no doubt that reconciling central government policy towards all of these various constituencies, again, that have been historically opposed to one another, have different historical narratives, different visions of what Ethiopia should be in terms of basic structures like federalism, the constitution.
Yeah.
It's always going to be very challenging.
Yeah, there's a lot more that we could get into there, and I think it's just worthwhile to just note that Abiy, since he came to power, has now still faces this rebellion in Oromia. We also hear from those talks, there's a lot of optimism that we could see an overall peace deal there soon. But he had this revolt in Tigray. Now he has this revolt in Amhara. So in very short order, he's faced major sort of insurgencies from, really the three most powerful, politically powerful communities in Ethiopia. And so this sort of turmoil continues.
And Alan, if I could just sort of weigh in with one point, because I think I've given, some might say I've given a fairly charitable sort of analysis of the predicament the federal government faces vis-a-vis reconciling its policies towards, the various ethnic groups and constituencies across the country. I think some might also say there's a real way in which the federal government, the prime minister, those that occupy state power in Addis benefit from some of the friction, fragmentation, division between, Ethiopia's various sort of key ethnic constituencies. So, that's also something that has to be, in fairness, I think that's something that also has to be put on the table. And some would argue that those that occupy central state authority in Addis are instrumentalizing, weaponizing some of those fissures. We do have to consider that factor as well.
So we'll get back to Ethiopian politics in a second, but how did Isaias respond to the peace deal in Pretoria?
So, I think we have to disentangle some of their official responses from sort of what they were thinking and saying privately. But I think, overall, there was a great deal of concern in Asmara about Pretoria and the Pretoria arrangement. And I think, one of the issues was that, the Eritrean state, the Eritrean leadership, President Isaias, were quite committed to the TPLF's sort of full defeat and elimination. And to the extent that Pretoria did do this, right, to the extent that Pretoria preserved the TPLF as a political force in Tigray, and I would argue today, still the governing sort of power in Tigray, this alarmed Isaias and sort of explains his opposition to Pretoria. Now, I think, in terms of public rhetoric or sort of public signaling, I think the Eritrean government is saying sort of it's reconciled itself to Pretoria and doesn't oppose Pretoria per se, but they do have concerns.
Yeah, so there's this other element here, which is all of the internal strife within Ethiopia with Tigray and now Amhara is kind of makes Eritrea and its ports like a scapegoat. In the same way a more authoritarian government might try to use a specific ethnic group as a scapegoat. Ethiopia's federal government is trying to say, hey, the reason we have so much unrest and turmoil, the reason we do not have access to the things we need, the reason you guys in Tigray and in Amhara don't have all of the goods and services that you need to survive, well, that's because Eritrea has all of the ports. And, if someone could just come along like Abiy and lead us to victory against Eritrea, you'd have all the things you would need. It's much quieter than me. I have it at like 100. I'll move it up to 200, but it's very, very loud for me.
Concerns about demobilization, of course, a slow demobilization process, because they see this large Tigrayan force as being a threat to them. So So I think that, that's that was sort of the overall sort of response or feeling about Pretoria, one of concern, some alarm. There are, of course, reports that they have not fully pulled back from territory, from a number of districts in northern Tigray.
I turned it up
this
to
is complicated
200%.
by the
I
fact
hope
that the
that's okay.
Eritrea-Tigray border is itself disputed, and so that's certainly, that situation is certainly a bit of a mess. So I think that's a broad response. Now, I think Pretoria did also create some tensions between Abiy and Isaias. Maybe it's too strong to say Isaias regarded Pretoria's betrayal, but it's certainly not the direction that he wanted to take the conflict in. Certainly was not happy with Abiy. And I think, Isaias gave an interview not long after Pretoria where he basically said that Pretoria had interrupted their military offensives and operations. And so he certainly was not happy with Abiy and the international backers of Pretoria for that reason. And so it's widened, I think, the gap between Addis and Asmara, but it's important to note that the gap had already been widening between Addis and Asmara prior to Pretoria. I think there were tactical and strategic differences about how to prosecute the war in Tigray. The president, I think, has said or implied that he was not happy with the pullout of federal forces from Tigray in the summer of 2021. So, I think there are tensions that had popped up between the two countries or two governments in the course of the Tigray war in terms of how to actually fight the war. As we move on into the post-Pretoria period, of course, I think there are concerns in Addis about the relationship between the Eritrean government and Amhara militia. And then layer on top of that, of course, some of Abiy's discourse around the Red Sea.
Yeah. Last month, the federal government released this recording of a speech made by Abiy, I believe, in June. It was definitely
yes. Here we
months
are.
early, but released this recording of Abiy giving a very long speech, basically saying Ethiopia has an imperative to get access to the sea.
Here we
It's
go.
a power that's too big to be landlocked, essentially. And obviously, the neighboring coastal countries haven't received this very well. But how do Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, how did regional capitals really think about this when Abiy sort of made these remarks?
Yeah, well, certainly on the part of Djibouti and Somalia, I mean, there were officials from both countries that came out and rejected these claims or some of the arguments that were being deployed in the video that you referenced. They're on record, I think, in that respect, and again are sort of concerned about what they see as the federal government's posturing on this particular question, this issue of sea access. I think the dynamic with Eritrea is a bit different. It's more complex, and I think the concerns in Eritrea are heightened in part because at one point Eritrea was part of Ethiopia, right? And so when you start making, and Ethiopia had control of Eritrean ports in Asab and Massawa and used it as their own, and so I think that when you start talking, when Ethiopia talks about
and that point, by the way, not that long ago, like 23 years ago, I think, was the conclusion of the Eritrean war for independence, and I like that's kind of when this happened. So again, the potential for Ethiopia to invade Eritrea is kind of predicated on the fact that isn't too long ago. Basically a second war for the liberation of Eritrea, or second war to keep Eritrea part of Ethiopia, I guess.
The federal government talks about sea access and historic access to the Red Sea specifically, that causes a particular kind of alarm, I would argue, in Eritrean circles. And so, and on top of that, of course, you've got these pre-existing tensions between Addis and Asmara. And again, this is a bit speculative, but some that have, there was a buildup to the public release of this video on the Red Sea. That government officials in Addis have been privately making arguments about the need for access to the Red Sea, and and at certain junctures might have implied that Eritrea was the most likely or probable case for for Ethiopian access to the sea, perhaps Zayla in Somaliland as well, and so
with Eritreans' war for independence, was it like North Ireland, where some rich folks just wanted to not pay into the country they were in? Kind of, yeah. Essentially, Eritrea, prior to being part of Ethiopia, was an Italian colony. And it was an Italian colony for like 75, 80 years. And after it was joined, there a lot of complicated stuff happened. I think it fell under British rule for a time, and then it was joined into Ethiopia, and then in the late 90s, it declared its independence and went to war against the rest of Ethiopia. So it's a complicated situation. I'm not going into its full history at the moment. But yeah, somewhat similar to that Disthrone, yes.
The point I think I'm making here is I think this discourse around the sea resonated, but was received in a particularly caused particular concerns and worries on the Eritrean side. And so I think there's a potential for conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia in this domain that it doesn't necessarily apply to Djibouti and Somalia. That's my take, at least. Although we could get into the likelihood of conflict, I don't necessarily think conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia at this juncture is likely, but there's a potential.
We'd been hearing all year, really, that this issue of getting access to the sea, that Abiy did see this as a legacy issue, and this was something that would be, increasingly forthcoming. But what's your sense of the timing of why push this? Obviously there's all this turmoil we've talked about in domestic politics, and the relationship with Eritrea has been.
I mean, it's good to know that, like, for people who have, like, in-depth and are basically paid to research the political machinations of this region, it's good to know that they don't feel like it's a likely thing. But it could be definitely a Hail Mary to, like, try and secure a re-election bid with the elections coming up. That's kind of my worry, is that, I mean, like, it's kind of a classic play, right? Like, if you're a Democratic leader and you want to maintain power in an election, declaring a war is not an unheard of way of doing that, especially against a country that is much, much smaller than you, and that you have you can convince your voters that you and they, by extension, have historical claim to it. That's kind of my worry here with Ethiopia.
Rocky, why make this push now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, of course, we do have to recognize that, partly what the federal government or Prime Minister Abiy is doing is sort of elevating earlier discourses about
Pando, thank you for the 200 biddies. Goyatolo, thanks for the 100 biddies.
Particularly from the imperial era, in the late 1940s, 1950s, when Ethiopia made very similar arguments, in the imperial era in terms of sort of access to the sea, and that paved the way for their control of Eritrea, of course. And indeed, earlier on in his prime ministership, the prime minister had kind of gestured at a Red Sea agenda, this whole idea of building an Ethiopian navy with, perhaps some French assistance. So I think...
like, guys, one thing you have to understand about the rhetoric is when the prime minister of Ethiopia is talking about building an Ethiopian navy, right now the country is landlocked. If you're talking about building an Ethiopian navy, it necessitates that you get a port somewhere and somehow, and usually the how is by invading another country. Given that the United States has ties with Djibouti, given that Ethiopia has pretty strong ties with Djibouti, like, Eritrea is kind of the logical option for them. If, again, that is their priority.
I say this because, as you indicate, these ideas had been percolating for a long time. It is interesting that they've now been brought to a head at this juncture, that they've been elevated in some way. And there are there are competing explanations. I won't take a position on any of them, but I'll lay some of them out. One is simply, some would argue this is sort of a politics of destruction.
Yeah, they're going to build a navy of land ships. They're going to use, like, wait, didn't they used to call like early tanks land ships? Early tanks, land ships. No, it's just showing me landing craft tanks. That's not
distraction.
Never
mind.
mind.
That's not to suggest, of course, that Ethiopia doesn't have real port needs and sea access needs. There are some legitimate issues, I think, undergirding this. But some argue that this is a question of distraction, right? Given the internal conflicts across the country.
Oh, they were? Okay, I just couldn't find it, like, in my initial Google search. Cool.
The government might be trying to sort of mobilize a nationalist impulse or nationalist sympathies. And more narrowly, some argue that because the idea of Red Sea access has sort of historically resonated, particularly amongst the Amharas, or the older Amhara political class, that the Prime Minister might be deploying this to sort of bring this community back on side. Now...
Aha! It has nothing to do with what is currently being talked about in regards to Ethiopia, but yes, after successful field demonstration in 1915, Britain established a secret land ships committee to study the military prospects of the vehicle. At first seen more like a warship than a land weapon. Nice.
I think one issue with that explanation is that I don't think it's particularly effective. I mean, I don't get the sense that this discourse around the Red Sea is necessarily mobilizing Amhara political support in favorable ways. I don't know if those appeals are really working, if that's the actual ambition. Another explanation might simply be that this might be kind of muscular signaling to Eritrea in the region that Ethiopia, that the prime minister is kind of reasserting himself as a regional force. The feeling might have been Ethiopia over the preceding couple of years had ceded too much regional influence to other countries, perhaps Eritrea, perhaps even Kenya, and that some of this is kind of signaling, sort of muscular signaling that Ethiopia is in fact a regional player, and a lot of that signaling perhaps might be vis-a-vis Eritrea. So I think that might be another explanation. And then there's just. You could also take, the prime, the rhetoric and the prime minister's position at face value and say that, look, they've drawn the conclusion that port access, and I'm not saying this is a correct conclusion, but this is their view that Ethiopia desperately needs port access at the moment. I mean, port access, control or something close to full control of their own port, and are deciding to push it forward at this juncture, particularly in light of some of the overall economic problems that the country is facing. I said earlier that I said that conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia specifically is possible but not necessarily likely. And I think one of the reasons it's not necessarily likely is that both parties simply can't afford conflict at this juncture. We've already talked about the various internal challenges that the federal government faces across the country, the various nodes of internal resistance across Ethiopia. You would also need, I think,
the issue here, right? The issue with, I think, this calculus is that the defensibility of regional resistance within Ethiopia cuts both ways, right? It's hard for the Ethiopian federalized military to go into a region to kind of suppress a potential civil war, but equally it's hard for people in that region to break out of it and inflict damage outside of it, So it could be that mobilizing the federal government's military against Eritrea would be a convenient excuse to then have a ready and battle-seasoned military to then turn on its internal dissent within regions like Amhara. So I don't know. That's my addition to this, I guess.
The Tigrayan forces, the large Tigrayan force, to kind of join in a potential fight of that type, and it's not clear to me as yet that Tigrayans wouldn't necessarily, or the TPLF, the leadership in Tigray, the interim administration would mobilize behind that effort. I think there's war fatigue. There's also suspicion of the federal government. And on the Eritrean side, look, Eritrea still is in some ways somewhat isolated internationally, although it's not quite the predicament that they faced back, in the 2010s. Obviously the economy, I think it's fair to say, remains moribund. It's likely the case that Eritrea is still a small country, probably some manpower challenges within the Eritrean Defense Forces, given the sheer number of Eritreans who have left the country over the last 2 decades. And I think overall, there's a feeling that, look, there's probably a lot of risk, an international risk, to getting into a fight with a big country like Ethiopia, right? The last time Eritrea and Ethiopia went to blows in 1998, the long run effect of that was Eritrea ended up getting isolated in the region internationally. Now, the year 2023 is not,
Yeah, just as kind of a point of comparison, Eritrea has a standing army of about 45,000 troops with potential reserves to be called up of 250,000. So in total, around 300,000 strong military, as opposed to Ethiopia, which has a standing army of around 138,000. So again, fully mobilized, Eritrea might be able to stand toe to toe with Ethiopia for a time. But I mean, just if you take out full mobilization and Ethiopia was instead to fully mobilize, it would be it would not be really a contest. Yeah.
The late 1990s, early 2000s, mid 2000s, but I think sort of history is probably informing some of their perspective here as well. And so I think that's my view. So we need to keep an eye on this. Obviously, I think a lot of people in the region, in the international community, are worried about the potential for conflict. But there's a lot of reasons for neither side to engage in open conflict. Of course, there always is the possibility of an inadvertent escalation. And indeed, just because war doesn't make sense in terms of our calculations of the interests of the parties doesn't mean it won't happen. And indeed, when Eritrea and Ethiopia went to war in 1998 over borders and economic issues, my sense is that conflict was mostly inadvertent escalation. No one really anticipated it. No one really wanted it for the most part.
Yeah, most of the conversations I've had with regional officials, diplomats who've been focusing on this, I think most are concerned of the risk of escalation and miscalculation.
The upshot of this, of course, is that the international community is increasingly, Western countries, some countries in the Middle East are increasingly aware of this point of tension, and I think that the hope is that given that awareness, they will sort of take concrete measures to bridge the divide between Addis and Asmara, or regional tensions more broadly. So to the extent that there might be tensions between Addis and Kenya, or Addis and Somalia and Djibouti over some of these Red Sea issues. And indeed, there was a statement from Secretary Blinken, I think last week or the week before, on sort of Ethiopia, sort of the 1 year Pretoria anniversary, where he sort of suggests that implies that we're aware of tensions between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and they need we need to work. These need to be de-escalated. That nobody benefits from a conflict, and I think that's the message that a lot of international diplomats are certainly sending privately. Now, I think one added layer or challenge here is that Eritrea's relations with the United States, with the West more generally, have not recovered, and so there is a bit of a challenge. I think they can talk to Addis on this issue, although that's not easy. But it's not they're not necessarily in a position where they can necessarily talk to Asmara, and so in that context, the Gulf countries I think are quite important.
Thank you, Michael. As always, thanks for your time. I'll just...
Yeah, again, this was a really eye-opening listen. I would recommend The Horn to y'all. It's quite a good look at different nations and geopolitical interests in Africa. But yeah, I mean, Catpig, you raise a good point. It's not a great move for Ethiopia to try and invade Eritrea. Basically the main thing Ethiopia has going for it is just that it has it has more people. It has more bodies that they can throw into the fray. They can basically pull a Russia circa World War II. Just throw bodies at Eritrea. Granted, the some of the same geographical concerns about the topography in Ethiopia also applies to Eritrea. There's basically a big wall of mountains before you get to kind of the flat area leading to the ocean. So yeah, it's not great. It's not great for either party. So in that respect, I agree with the assessment at the end of that podcast that neither party would really benefit. However, our calculus is not the calculus of the ruling interests in Ethiopia. So it kind of depends on where their priorities lie. Russia still do meat waves in Ukraine? True. They do just do meat waves. Oh boy. Yeah, and as far as I know, Eritrea doesn't have a ton of major allies. Really, the allies Eritrea has right now seem to be like informally through Egypt and Sudan, largely predicated on Egypt and Sudan hating the dam that Ethiopia is building. So, um, I don't know if that's enough, really, but hopefully it doesn't all boil over, and hopefully you all got something out of that coverage. I hope my background info and then like commentary along with that podcast helped to like fill in a lot of gaps here.